Greetings everyone. Welcome back to my channel. So today let's see about an outline of literary criticism. Yeah. So this comes under B. Prasad's A Background to the Study of English Literature. Well, this chapter is actually a lengthier one and I have shortened as much as possible, right? So to begin with, let's see about the function of criticism. So what do you think is the function of criticism? So it is an intermediary between the author and the reader, explaining the one to the other. Or, in other words, it can be understood as an interpreter between the inspired and the uninspired. So, a criticism explains the full value and meaning of the work, and it is definitely helpful to those who can't grasp the meaning. So, hope you'd have understood the function of criticism. So now, critic as a judge. So, what do you think is the role of a critic? So, judging the faults and merits of a work. So, a critic gives a verdict on the merits of a book, and based on his knowledge of the subject, he does that, and he acts the part of a judge. So, the subject of critics one's own choice. So interpretation is actually the essence of judgment, and it definitely shows the true value of a work of art, right? So you could understand the role of critic as a judge as well. So there are two functions of criticism. What are those? Judgment and appreciation. Fine. Let's see about the differences between the classical and the romantic criticism, or in other words, the differences between the dogmatic and the impressionistic. So now comes the classical criticism or the dogmatic criticism. So it belongs to the older order with respect for tradition and a sound knowledge of literature of the past. And this mode began with the Renaissance, and this consists of a uniform standard, hence, it is termed as dogmatic, and it lays specific emphasis on the judicial function of criticism, thereby adhering to the rule of ancient classics as codified by Aristotle and his followers. So, here we could see that the right judgment gives the right enjoyment. Yeah, and this mode of criticism dominated the 16th, 17th, and 18th century Europe. And Aristotle's Poetics is actually the master key to the treasures of literature. And this particular mode of criticism stands for judgment based on absolute standards and established conventions. Now comes the romantic criticism, or in other words, the impressionistic one. So there was a change with the French Revolution, and it signed with a shaking off the shackles of classical authority. And it was found that these particular group of critics, they ascertained that a work of art is independent of any outside aid. So this form of criticism is entirely subjective, and it is not at all affected by outside standard sources, right? And these critics express the sensations that the new work had evoked. And what I think is the connection between criticism and literature. So, criticism derives existence from literature. A piece of criticism is equal to insight, imagination, learning, and command of the language. So, as Macaulay calls it, a criticism or a piece of criticism is as interesting or entertaining as any novel. Fine. So, what do you think are the qualifications of a critic? So, a critic must have a natural aptitude. He must be firm and steady in his standards. He must be responsive to new impressions. He must be sensitive. He must be penetrating. He must be wise. And of course, he must be free from bias. So, These are the qualifications of a critic. Well, so here comes a topic that finds way for criticism before and after Dryden. So before Dryden, so there was much little to boast of criticism before Dryden, except for Sidney's defense of poetry, right? And then comes John Dryden. So he was the first critic to apply systematic application of critical standards, right? And he was the very first one to teach Englishmen to determine upon principles. I mean, the merit of work of art. And he was ardently followed by Pope and Dr. Johnson. And what happened after Dryden was that there was a complete change with the coming of Wordsworth. So there are set full reaction against the stuff that was portrayed by Dryden, and it gave certain signs in the 19th century. I mean, in the beginning of the 19th century. So a liberal outlook in criticism happened. Criticism was asked to be freed from the yoke of the classics. So Coleridge and other critics followed Wordsworth. So it seemed wayward, but it seemed ill for the future. So even Matthew Arnold saw the danger in it. So when it comes to Matthew Arnold, he talks about a code of conduct in criticism. So, a study of all relevant facts of the author shows his personality, the mental atmosphere of his age, the motive of his art, and its relation to life. So, Arnold's the study of poetry poignantly stressed the seriousness of absolute sincerity. So here comes a variety of theories of literature and criticism in the 20th century. So these are trends set by American and European thinkers. So what are those? Russian formalism, psychological criticism, archetypal criticism, neo criticism, structuralistic criticism, new forms of feministic criticism, Marxist criticism, deconstruction, and reader response criticism. So I've elaborated a few as much as simple, right? To begin with, it is the Russian formalism. So this movement originated in Moscow during the 1920s and 1930s. So the representative of this mode of criticism were Boris Eichenbaum, Victor Slowsky, and Roman Jakobson. So this form of criticism was suppressed by the Soviets during the 1930s. So Russian formalism shifted its activities to Czechoslovakia. Roman Jakobson, Rene Welek continued to influence in American universities. So, what are the approaches of formalism? So, here we could see a specialized mode of language. A basic distinction between the poetical use of language and a practical use of language is found here. So, what do you think is the practical use of language? It is highly communicative, conveying message, and obviously portraying day-to-day activities or highlighting the external world. So, when it comes to the literal use of language, you could find it to be a specific mode of experience, quite self-focused with formal features. So, what do you think is the primary aim of formalist? To estrange or defamiliarize the world of everyday perception, or in other words, to renew the reader's capacity for fresh sensation. So now we could see that something else happens, reconnecting Coleridge's idea of freshness of sensation. Well, so Coleridge, in his Biographia Literaria, shows up value of making strange the representation of familiar objects or to evoke a freshness of sensation. So here, obviously, we could connect both, right? Well, now comes the psychological or psychoanalytical criticism. So these were based on an assumption that a work of art is the expression of an individual author's state of mind or personality. And it is a way of accessing the author's consciousness and a prominent feature. So this is a prominent feature of literary studies during the 19th century. So 19th century criticism will be incomplete without this psychological or psychoanalytical criticism. So actually psychoanalytical criticism is the variant type of psychological approach in the 20th century. And psychoanalytical criticism is actually based on the procedures established by Sigmund Freud. So, Freud's introduction to psychoanalysis. So, an introduction to psychoanalytical criticism. Actually, this introduction to psychoanalysis is actually the 23rd lecture of Freud. And through this lecture, he sets forth the key principles of psychoanalytical criticism. So, here it is attributed to dreams and neurotic symptoms. So, literature provides an outlet for repressed desires and fantasies, fantasies in the sense mainly sexual. And so, with these kind of portrayals, we could find the conflict into social standards and morality. So, here, however, he justifies that by saying that connecting it with an artistic expression. So it permits the individual to achieve a fantasized satisfaction of those desires that well up the unconscious. So now comes the archetypal criticism that began around 1930s and flourished during the 1940s. So what do you mean by the word archetype? It's none other than an idealized model. So they are repeated patterns of experience in the lives of our very ancient ancestors that survive in the collective unconscious. So we could see that, or we could find that the memory of the human race, as expressed in myths and rituals, dreams, and private fantasies, gets portrayed in the form of archetypal criticism. So, archetypal criticism is equal to the mythical patterns in literature. So, who are those archetypal critics? Maud Watkins' archetypal patterns in poetry, and some other practitioners are G. Wilson Knight, Richard Chase, and Robert Graves. So, the recurrent mythical patterns in literature. So, myths are naturally closer to the elemental experience of man than to the artistic or artificial creation of writers. For other examples that you could find are Dante's Divine Comedy, which is highly archetypal, and Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Well, now comes new criticism. So, here, new criticism, as the title suggests, says a big no to outside sources. So, this kind of criticism was actually advocated by a group of academics writing in the first half of the 20th century. So they consider texts as autonomous and closed, right? Or separate entities. So everything that is needed to understand a work is present within it, says these critics. And they also claim that a reader does not need outside sources to understand a text. So here they focus their attention on the variety and degree of certain literary devices, especially like metaphor, irony, tension, and paradox. So here we could see that these critics emphasized a close reading as a way to engage with the text and paid close attention to the interactions between form and meaning. So, who are the critics of this particular mode of criticism? Alan Tate, Robert Penn Warren, John Crowe Ransom, Cleant Brooks, William Emerson, and F.R. Lewis. Well, what are the characteristics of new criticism? So we could see that new criticism formulates the autonomy of the work, and they are not bothered about the social context of a book. These critics are least bothered about external circumstances, right? And they consider a detailed analysis of the text as a verbal entity. So they propagate a critical method of close reading. So it is highly detailed, and it contains subtle analysis of the ambiguities in the verbal components of the text. And we could see them isolated from the social, historical, and emotional context of the text. So new criticism is kept in isolation from the social, historical, and emotional context of the text. So now comes another variety, phenomenological criticism, that began around 1940s and flourished around the 1950s. So it consists of the theory and practice of the Geneva School of Critics, philosophy of the German thinker formulated by the philosophy of the German thinker Edmund Husserl. So he attempts to overcome the division between subject and object, or the mental and the material, by examining consciousness and the object of consciousness simultaneously. So Husserl's theory was extended by Martin Heidegger in Germany and Maurice Merleau in France. And then comes structuralism. So this propagates a new direction to criticism. And structuralism has become almost an influential mode of criticism. It began in France during the 1950s. Roland Barthes and the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss formulated this particular mode of criticism called structuralism. It is all inclusive. So, language, according to the structuralist, consists not only about only the speech, but includes signs and signification as well, and it includes all codes of communication. So, Ferdinand de Saussure. So, he is a Swiss linguistic. He propounds the concept of language as a sign system or structure in structuralism. So, individual components can be understood, as he says, only in relation to each other. For example, hut. So, here we could find a series of related terms like oval, shed, mansion, or palace finds in relation to each other in the mind of the reader. So they are entirely conventional, relational, and self-referential, right? So here, the principal characteristic here is no significance in isolation. So, as he says, as Saussure formulates, no work has significance in isolation. All individual work can be understood only in terms of the relationship between itself and the structure of expectation, obviously that which exists in the reader's mind. So it completely opposes the communication. So structuralism opposes any form of the view that literature is a mode of communication between the author and the reader. So the text consists of relevant conventions and codes. So no importance to the individual author is given as the sole creator or origin of the work. So here Roland Barthes declares the death of the author. Fine. So according to him, the author is dead. So structuralism replaces the author by the reader. So here we could find that the role of the author is nil. So the traditional concept of the reader as a conscious feeling individual is replaced by the impersonal activity of reading, exploring the conventions and codes that exist in the text. So we could see that the role of the author is completely gone. And now comes post structuralism. So It is a term for the philosophical and literary forms of theory that both build upon and reject ideas established by structuralism. So it is formulated by the theorist Jacques Derrida. So Derrida's paper on structure, sign, and play in the discourse of the human sciences formulates post-structuralism, and it focuses mainly on language, which is considered to be a system in constant change. So here we could find that it decenters the subject, and we could find the deletion of the author, and it leaves the reader as the focal point of post structural criticism. We could find that the text is an uncontrollable play of decentered signifiers. So we could find that the reader is stripped of human attributes, and it directs an impersonal process of reading. We could also find that the text becomes a mere structure of signifiers, and the text is replaced by the term discourse here, denoting the verbal material of the text. Now comes deconstruction. So it was begun by Jacques Derrida. It is actually a new kind of reading practice, and it denotes that the text contains plurality of significance, and many different meanings from a single stable meaning is formed here. So here he attributes that a text cannot convey a guaranteed essential meaning. So here we could see an undesirable play of linguistic meanings. So two significant words that were coined by Derrida is difference and dissemination. So what do you mean by difference? A continuous and endless postponement of meaning. So dissemination, the innumerable internal linguistic forces. So here, deconstruction is actually a way of reading all types of texts that allures lots of meanings, right? And now, to finish off, here comes the reader response criticism. Actually, this is a joint construct. It originated in the 1960s in Germany, and it's a joint construct through interaction between the words on a page and the reader. So here we could find numerous different approaches, because different readers give different approaches to a particular text, isn't it? A reader's interaction with the text gives different meanings to the text. So a text cannot exist without the reader. Here we could find that a text plus a reader gives an exact meaning, right? So, who are the critics of this particular school of criticism? Norman Holland, Stanley Fish, Wolfgang Iser, Hans Robert Joss, Louis Rosenblatt, and David Blanche. So, with this comes an end to this topic. Thank you for watching. So those who haven't subscribed, do subscribe and watch.